Hello and welcome to Virtual Investor Conferences. My name is Eric May, and on behalf of OTC Markets, we're very pleased you have joined us for our next live presentation from Graphite One Inc. Please note, you can submit questions for the presenter in the box to the left of the slides. You can also view the company's availability for one-on-one meetings through the Schedule Meetings tab found on the conference platform. At this point, I am very pleased to welcome Anthony Houston, President and CEO of Graphite One, which trades on the OTCQX Best Market under the symbol GPHOF and on the TSXV under the symbol GPH. Welcome, Anthony.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone today. And I really appreciate being invited by the OTC to present today. So much has happened for G1 in the last year. There's a lot of process that we wouldn't be able to disclose. So we've got a lot of ground to cover this morning. So please note the safe harbor slide at the onset. We have a truly talented management slide and a team that we've put together over the last 5 years, which we continue to build out as we work towards completion of our feasibility study and our anode manufacturing facility. There's also a snapshot of our cap table. And of course, I'm happy to provide more quantitative detail on request. I call those our who and how slides. And don't get me wrong, having the right team with the right experience and the right plan, that's critical. To use a word that's a perfect fit when we're talking about graphite. The who and how are essential, but to make great things happen, who and how aren't enough. You need to know the why it matters, no matter what it is. Great things happen when your why aligns with the trends and transformations shaping our world and the generations ahead. And that's why I'm convinced the G1 is really at an inflection point, because graphite is a critical mineral for the renewable energy revolution. Next slide, Natalie. The electrification of everything. Arthur Clarke, the great futurist, had a great saying. Any sufficiently developed technology appears first as magic. Our minds don't naturally ask, what makes that tech work? And in the case of lithium-ion batteries, like that Elon Musk quote about graphite, don't think of graphite as the indispensable technology material. We just take it for granted. And the fact that we take graphite for granted, that we don't make the connection between the materials that make this possible and the magic of the devices we use, that's okay. That's our market opportunity. That's what makes G1 such a great bet as investors, like all of us, to arbitrage your knowledge of how this new world of ours works. And there's another part of the why that drives us. Because if you think of the materials we need to make this new world, but here's the disconnect. Graphite is everywhere. But in the US right now, and for the past 30 years, you can't get graphite anywhere. There's a graphite crisis. Start at the top left, 100%. That's how much the US graphite has to import today. Another way of saying production right now is zero. Move to 70%. That's how much of the world's supply is coming out of China. How is the US going to compete in these new technologies shaping our world? Are we going to be a maker or a taker? Able to build what we need here or buying it from a country that wants to take America's place in the world? Did you notice when China announced they'll put tight export controls on graphite? China knows it's critical. You don't need me to tell you how dangerous that is. Depending on foreign sources of supply, in a world where adversaries can use materials access as an economic weapon, it's just not tenable. And when you have a deposit like Graphite Creek, it's more than untenable, it's irresponsible. I want to talk about American competitiveness, about American manufacturing, about equipping the American military with the most advanced weapon systems in the world. How is it going to work with zero graphite production? Back to our numbers, 95%. That's how much graphite is in the typical battery anode. You can't make one without graphite, and a lot of it. How much? 494%. That's the increase the World Bank's projection is to how much graphite the world will need by 2050. 2,500% and 15 to 1. Those are the other snapshots of how much graphite we're going to need. It's a crisis. There's no other word for it. But let me get back to that first 100% for a moment and back to our why. Because as complicated as it is to begin production of a mineral that hasn't been mined for more than a generation, and to create the downstream supply chain to process that mineral into advanced forms, and ultimately to recycle that material for recovery and reuse, it's the why that animates us at Graphite One. Our answer to 100% US dependency is Graphite One's 100% US-based supply chain. Next. Our anchor is our Graphite Creek deposit north of Nome. Next. The U.S. Geological Survey calls it the largest natural graphite deposit in the U.S. And the USGS came back in 2023 to add, and I quote, among the largest in the world. We've only explored a little over 1 square kilometer along our 16-kilometer deposit. Before too long, we're going to update our resource after a strong drilling season in 2023. But even now, I can tell you that Graphite Creek is a national asset in its own right, a generational resource that's going to provide a critical mineral throughout the 21st century. But even a generational resource isn't enough by itself, because of securing access to a 21st century tech material is not just about supply. It's about the supply chain. Next. We recently announced a major step, the site selection for the second link in our supply chain. Graphite One will build its anode active material manufacturing plant in Niles, Ohio. Ironically, we've chosen the site of the old Warren Depot. It's the former U.S. National Defense stockpile site, which 50 years ago included the Department of Defense's graphite stockpile, which is of course no more. You'll hear more related to this new development in the next coming months, so stay tuned. But G1's supply chain strategy is taking shape. Next slide. It's building on the major U.S. government grant we just received last July from the Department of Defense. Under the Defense Production Act Title III authorities, after graphite was designated, and I quote, essential to the national defense. We received $37.5 million to help G1 cut at least a year off of our feasibility study timeline. And we made great use of the DoD funding to more than quadruple our 2023 drilling program compared to 2022. And as a result, we're on track to complete our feasibility on the DoD timetable by the end of this year. Listen to Senator Lisa Murkowski. Next slide. The U.S. Congress's thought leader on critical minerals, as she talks about the importance of our G1 grant on the Senate floor. Next slide. I couldn't have said it any better. That DoD grant was just the first of 2 G1 grants received this last year. Our second grant came last September from the Defense Logistics Agency, the overseers of the National Defense Stockpile. Don't let the smaller dollar amount, $4.7 million, fool you. This grant to develop a graphite-based foam suppressant to meet the congressional mandate to replace the incumbent firefighting material, which is dangerous to human health and the environment. It's an important reminder that advanced graphite materials are important well beyond the EV and energy system sectors. Arthur Clarke was right. New technologies appear first as a form of magic, and graphite is truly a magical material. Next slide. In terms of strategic support, one of our key investors that we are very grateful for is the Bering Straits Native Corporation. As you see in Dan Graham's quote, President of Bering Straits Native Corporation, their unanimous board decision, all 15, stems from their interest in being part of the clean energy transition. Remember the why G1 matters. Next slide. And as I mentioned, we've had incredible support from also Governor Dunleavy, from Senator Murkowski, who has continually elevated the critical minerals issue in the Senate, from Senator Sullivan, who serves on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and Alaska's Congresswoman Mary Peltola, the successor to the late great Don Young, who understood the importance of resource development. With Alaska's engagement at both the state and federal levels, we've got opportunities to collaborate and get creative. And that to the federal government's growing support for domestic critical development. Next slide. And as you can see, there's a strategic element supporting the why behind G1. That's all I can say about that this morning, but please watch the space. I go through our project catalysts, our government support from Alaska to Washington, D.C. Next slide. Our location on Alaska state land. Our world-class resource based on a tiny fraction of our entire deposit. The strong relationships G1 has with local and regional Alaska communities. Next slide. And our major milestones. Our accelerated progression to our feasibility at the end of this year, thanks to our DoD grant, and our plans to accelerate the synthetic graphite production at our Ohio facility, where we will start to build and produce 25,000 tons. All of that helps to explain how well positioned G1 is for the transition taking place around us, because it captures the why that drives us forward. The fact that graphite is indispensable to the technologies transforming the 21st century. From mining to refining to recycling, Graphite One is going to provide the US's first full advanced graphite supply chain. It's a great place to be in a tech-driven economy, pushing to a net zero future. The world needs more graphite, and the US needs Graphite One. Thank you for your time today and for this chance to share our G1 story. Question, does starting with synthetic mean a shift away from natural and Graphite Creek? It's a great question. Actually, no, not at all. We've been looking for ways to innovate on the traditional linear timeline of developing a deposit and then processing the material and selling into the market. We're capitalizing on two factors. One, the common battery chemistry for anodes that use both natural and synthetic. And two, the strong market for graphite of both kinds. So by starting with synthetic anode material in Ohio, we will begin generating revenue even as Graphite Creek moves through permitting. That's a strong position to be in, as anyone who has developed a mine will tell you. Another question, you discontinued your arrangement with Sunrise in China. What can you say about your partners in anode processing? So for context, I want to underscore one point that you'll see is obvious, but often overlooked. The US has not mined graphite since 1991, which means graphite mining stopped well before Bill Gates and Steve Jobs revolutionized microcomputing, before the public internet, before cell phones, before EVs, and a whole host of everyday applications we have now. And when you don't mine a resource, you lose more than access to the raw material. You lose the knowledge base for processing the material into advanced forms. The material scientists who worked with that material, engineers who designated to it. And since there was no ready supply, the US lost all of that. And at a time of tremendous technological innovation, most of that specialized knowledge migrated to China. Graphite is not alone. It's the same for rare earths, for instance for gallium. Maybe that's why the Department of Defense designated graphite and others at DPA Title III essential to the national defense. So G1 is putting together a processing team with a technology license agreement that will be IRA compliant for tax incentives. And we're likely to involve a U.S. national lab as well. We'll have more on that to stay soon, so stay tuned. In regards to our DoD work, we report regularly to the DoD, according to their protocol for both of our projects. Both of our projects are on time and on target. You'll appreciate we can't and won't comment much beyond that. But as G1 has publicly identified the accelerated feasibility timetable on our DPA grant, I can say specifically that we're on track for completing our feasibility at the end of this year. We see both of these grants as validators of G1's complete US-based supply chain strategy, and you won't be surprised to hear we continue to engage the US government at the high levels with every relevant agency and department. Another question, what drew the company to select manufacturing sites in Ohio as opposed to Washington State? We are still working actually with some sites in Washington State. In Ohio, there's some news that will come out soon that will tell you a little bit more as to why we chose Ohio. Ohio is known for its manufacturing, and Ohio has embraced us as to what we're doing with the processing side. And so we're very excited to be working with everyone in Ohio. What is the ownership structure of Graphite One? We have owners out of Alaska. Our largest shareholders are Taiga Mining. They're the largest private mining company in Alaska, owned privately, and they own about 30% of Graphite One. Management owns about 15%, and the rest is spread out quite evenly. Forthcoming and catalyst this year. Yeah, that's an excellent question and one that we're very excited for. Again, the feasibility for the entire project will come out at the end of this year. That will also include Ohio and the feasibility for the 25,000 tons for the synthetic. As well, we expect to come out with more news as to potential partners that we potentially could be getting, as well as some more interest and focus and work with the United States government, both on the 2 grants that we received within the Department of Defense and some other grants that we're focused on that are out there through the Department of Energy. So start of construction is planned for 2027. That's for the anode facility, the synthetic anode facility in Ohio. And so then we plan to go into full production in 2028. And that again is for the synthetic side. And the natural side will be in 2029. Are the U.S. federal or state governments accelerating the permitting process for clean energy transition? That's a great question. That is definitely on the table, and something that I think you'll see there'll be more and more discussion on that, especially as we're in election year. Thank you all very much for your time today.